Why does Joe Madureira's line work hit so hard even when it seems like he's leaving out so much detail in rendering? It's all about economy of line, the art of drawing only what matters most. And I've been obsessed with it, mostly because I've never been a natural at it. Attempting to draw with such simplicity and dynamics is harder than it looks. That's why I've decided to copy Joe Mad's art in this video and find out what's really happening once and for all. I'll be showing my whole process of copying this piece by Joe Mad, breaking down a lot of the line work, and extracting his line economy techniques so you can take your work to the next level. If you're interested in Joe Mad in general and want to learn more about him and his style, check out this previous video I made. I do a full breakdown of his style and it's pretty interesting. So before I dive in, let me red team the opposition to this whole line economy movement. You might be asking, what if I'm a fan of Berserk or Kim Jong-gi or any number of artists like Brian Boland in America who have like a really intense quantitative effort toward using line? Well, I hear you. Those artists make genius works and their stuff is almost antithetical to the economy of line approach. And from a certain respect, there's a lot of things there to focus on. And first and most importantly, sometimes the sheer volume and the cluttering of lines creates an exact mood that you're looking for of tension. If you removed half the line work, say in Berserk, what would you be left with? And I don't think it would be the same thing, that's for sure. Next, the editing mind that it takes to do some of this minimalistic approach can sometimes constrain the artistic exploration that may potentially remove personality in your work. And last, sometimes detail is simply what the artist is going for. It's just a maximizing philosophy that's pretty different from the minimalistic one, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that this is the only way, but if you ask me, art with great line economy is the most iconic, memorable, and impactful, even if it has to sacrifice some darker moods and uglier human nature type themes that can be depicted with that kind of style. So like I said, this is the piece that I decided to copy. I thought it was simplified, refined, and has that impact that we're always fond of from Joe Mad. So this is what I ended up with. At first glance, after I did the study, I thought I did pretty well. The pose reads, the anatomy works, it looks pretty similar to what I was studying. But the more I looked, the more I saw I was still missing what makes his line so smart. The economy of line is all about making intentional choices. And I feel like I didn't know what the intention was. I just knew I was copying down lines. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I didn't even show you how I got here. So let's start from blank page. I block in the character Red Monica and use a standard method of copying that most artists use when they draw from a subject. If you're new to art, it's using relatively straight lines to block in shapes and all the while flicking your eyes back and forth between your subject and your art. In fact, your eyes should probably be more on your subject than your art. I think it's pretty standard. Anybody who's looking more at their artwork and not at the subject will probably end up with something that is not as reflective and or influenced by their own viewing of the subject. I'm really trying to pay attention here to how far apart each shape is from another. So very quickly, I started to have trouble judging the relationships of the face. So I did a quick trace over. I thought this might help. Sometimes tracing can really help you move forward in a quicker way than trying to guess at it. You got to be careful there because tracing can also hinder you. The goal here is to get the proportions right, but not perfect. So I didn't mind doing this trace over effect. With the proportions close to matching, I started to see, once I did the final lines, how economy really comes into play. Something happens when you start laying down the final lines. You kind of are more conscious of what's the final look going to be. I actually traced over the originals to start again because I wanted to feel how the lines felt spatially with my fingertips. Which brings us to the economic feats that Joe Mad is bringing to the table here. And this is number one. And I just like to label it as foreshortening with minimal lines or as much clarity as possible. There's a ton of examples of this in Joe's work where you look back and he takes something kind of complex like foreshortening an arm straight at you or some sort of effect that's kind of in a distorted way because it's so energetic. Foreshortening is very tricky regardless if you're trying to stylize it or not. So putting stylized anatomy can even bring another layer of difficulty for amateur, beginner, and even intermediate artists. I did try to visualize all the anatomy as simple volumes, and that does help. But here we're trying to focus on how do we simplify things into an economic set of line work. And that cues me to the second economic feat that he pulls off here. It's detail that is so strategic that as I'm copying closer and closer to the figure's face, I realize the detail is also picking up, almost as if he's framing the face with detail. And I was almost even more impressed, and I thought there was going to be more detail as I drew. Sometimes you are informed as you draw, you don't realize actually how minimal or how exuberant the detail is. But in this case, I really didn't get the sense that I would be drawing so little and getting so much for it, which is the whole point of line economy. As I near the completion, I realized that the third feature of his impactful line art is the grouping of shadows. Joe Mad doesn't let a ton of bounce light in to complicate the lighting. He combines cast shadows and core shadows to form very interesting shapes that are very Joe Mad, and using that shape language in a grouping of shadows way really makes the piece even more simplified. I realized the coolest and the hardest part about figuring out economy of line is that it's up to your individualistic artistic senses. Like, only you are going to be able to figure out what you should remove and what you should keep. And that's really cool. I really expected to understand more of what was going on behind the scenes, like in my head as I'm doing the line work. I took my time and really thought out each step, but still, practically and I guess a matter of fact of just artistic mileage, I wasn't getting enough out of it. Proportions were actually still pretty good, so that's how I knew something was a little bit wrong, a little off in my eyes. So that's it. I realized that getting nice line economy is almost impossible. The end. Well, that's not actually where it ended. I was too stubborn. I really wanted to know more about how to get the right sense of what to pull out and why certain lines were actually being used by Joe. Because if I realized anything from my copy session, was that my choices were not always informed. I had a sense that I needed more experience, essentially. Welcome to part 2. So it's back to the drawing board for me, but this time I went to look for specifics. I knew what I was missing this time around. I knew that I was having trouble with getting the anatomical shapes and the foreshortening to read as clear as Joe Mad was getting. So I took a look at his figures to see what, if anything, could I learn that I hadn't recognized already. So with this piece, all I did was trace the general shapes of the figures. And from there, I did some observational learning because essentially I'm not tracing details. I'm tracing the general forms and then observing and learning that way. So with this piece, there's so many figures, I'm about to learn a whole lot. In this case, I'm seeing with this smaller figure that the joints and the main mass of anatomy for the arms and shoulders are quite a bit exaggerated. And the more exaggerated you can make those, the easier it is to foreshorten because the shapes that you're associating with the shoulder will be a little bulkier, and then you can have a little bit more contrast of how the lines blend as you foreshorten. In this case, he's using thin joints and larger hands and shoulders to exaggerate enough where the foreshortening is a little easier to pull off. So as I traced this figure of Wolverine, I found Wolverine's really bulky and the anatomy is not thick to thin. In this case, his answer was nestling muscle groups one in front of the other, but using a sharp kind of shape to feed into the next muscle group. This brought me back to like my days of studying not only George Bridgman, but also Michael Hampton's anatomy, where Hampton would describe it as like a T shape. And George Bridgman, early on when I started studying, he definitely used the word wedging. And this is what it kind of reminds me of. Joe Mad is wedging these muscle groups into each other as it comes toward the camera. So when a line runs perpendicular to another line, we can say that the line that is stopping the line perpendicular to it is the line that is in front of the other. So it's going to appear like that line is in front. It's the simplest way to show space in like a 3D environment with just a line. Third is the line of action in this other figure. It's crazy. This is something you really forget to think about when you're doing a copy study because you assume that the lines are basically laid out already. And so you forget that all these underlying thoughts are being figured out by the original artist, including line of action. So looking at this figure, it's very interesting because it made me think I probably should be paying more attention. And this is important because I really do think, even though I wasn't thinking about it at first, paying more attention to how lines are really more subtly lining up within the figure. And this last example, I think is great. It's to help form a better silhouette through shading. So here he's shading the cape that's behind the figure. It's using a background element to help the silhouette. Without that shadow shape, this figure of Magneto would not really be a good silhouette. It's one that would not pass the art director test if you had one. And you almost need that shading on the cape to clearly see some more of the body, enough of the body that you know what's going on. I'm actually really surprised when I did this study. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to find, and I really quickly found that I was missing a lot. I found exactly what I needed in the intention department behind the lines that Joe was making. So with this next study, I went with something that was even more simple, like, for example, concept art. I think these are props for one of his games, and they really feel Joe Mad-like, and I thought they were perfect to figure out what was really going on the simplest levels. It only took my first few drawings to figure out that there was an alternate utility for using heavy line weights. I know in a previous video I mentioned this before in a different way, but line weights are there for dynamic contrast to like really pop something into the foreground. But here I think there is an added focus that I didn't realize before. I think if you focus on economy of line, if you really think about it, putting this heavy contour around a figure or anything is not just for dynamics, it's to help show the lighting or pop things into the foreground. But in this case, for economy of line, it's doing something different. And you'll see what I mean in a second. First, let me show you an example from something I use as a commercial storyboard artist. It's a rule that all storyboard artists abuse in one way or another because it's just a good way to trick the human eye. The thicker a contour is around anything makes the eye focus there no matter what. Even if there was a crazy setup that you drew, like with a lot of messy lines, your eye is only going to go to the thickest line. So it just really helps pop things out of the figure. And so if you put a heavy contour around something, it's going to make your eye go there. And the genius here in regards to line economy is that no matter what other detail you have, if you put the contour around an object, it is only going to set you up for a clearer and more finessed line economy than you otherwise would have. The other idea that was reinforced when I did this study was to always give your detail a focal point, or rather use your detail as a focal point. Remember when I talked about like a little bit of detail being more and more increased around Red Monica's face as the hair was curling and did all these cool things? That's what you want to do with whatever your focal point is in your artwork. Here he does it with like the skull and this gate, and it's just a great way to add focus, and it gives you a way to go about figuring what you can remove, what you can't remove. Because if it's around your focus, maybe keep the detail. If it's a little farther away from the focus, if it's not a part of the storytelling, if it's not a part of like something key that would help you figure out if the figure is in action, in motion, or some other element, maybe remove it. So this isn't my first Joe Mad study after all, but I kind of know what I'm looking for now, and it's kind of psyched me up to do something else. So this time I wasn't just copying shapes, I was actually thinking what was going into each line and trying to figure it out on a much deeper level. So again, I started with blocking in this figure, and this time I meant it. I really started to draw through, like using the method of drawing through to find the volumes within the drawing. I saw how he was using the anatomical simplification from the previous study, as well as the line of action that cuts right through. And I could see that like his chin lines up with like his chest, or at least what would be his chest if something wasn't there, like his clothes. I had a feeling that my proportions were a little more off, more wrong than in my first attempt, but I didn't think that matters. I think I learned way more than what I did on the first one because of everything that I'm about to show you. Here I did a mini study of how the wrapping of the spiral folds in his gloves worked. They're kind of tricky, but so by the end of it, I think I actually understood it way more. I know with fabric, things bunch together, like on your shirt, and where there might be 3 or 4 or 5 folds in one spot in real life, if you like simplify it, it means that just pull that back down to 1. Joe Mad would just put 1 bunch. If there's like something bunching up, just make it 1. The other side, make it flat, and you can get the idea that this is what it means to simplify the lines down to just the essentials. Then I start cleaning up my lines and realizing that he used that line weight thing in his contours almost everywhere. Like, that's really a big help for him to get his focus where he wants you to look. Then I got a brilliant idea. I figured I could trace on top of the original and figure out exactly where and how many of those T-joint wedges that we looked on in that last study and where they are in this figure. And so I traced them all. It took a little while, but it really gave me a sense of, wow, there's a ton of these. And even if you remove the line art like here, you can almost count them, be like, oh, I can actually see where he's emphasizing, spatial relationships and seeing what's closer to the camera and where it really is meaningful to have those T-shapes, those wedgings. I decided to do what I didn't do with my last of the mini studies and break down how Joe's grouping the shadows. I wanted to document how many cast shadows were actually present in his original, and actually how many cast shadows were omitted. If you were really paying exact attention to the lighting that he's including, you might include more cast shadows and not less. And so he even pulled back to have more clarity there as well. Then I see that he doesn't even fully cast a shadow on the inside of a glove, and I'm like, that would definitely be in shadow. And I really was surprised at how much he omitted here. I thought it was pretty cool to see his approach to using shadow for his own purposes. So with all that in mind, I'm getting back to laying down my final lines. And I know my proportions are a little off here, I think you can tell, but I had a feeling that this was getting so much more information as I was doing the study for my own learning. And so I didn't really care that I was missing the proportion mark a little bit. So here I traced the planes of his fingers, because hands can be pretty tough. And if you trace the planes, you can kind of more easily find them in 3D space. So from this point on, I really tried to stylize the lines as much as possible as Joe Mad would do. I noticed that with the wedging and the grouping of the shadows and everything else, the image just became more and more right in my mind. It felt like I was actually drawing more like Joe Mad and not just a copy. You know the difference when you feel it. There's a sense that I could draw it almost without looking at his copy, because I started to feel what the lines were there for. I know this simplified beard that I drew here, the clothes and everything else, like really gave me a sense that I knew what I was doing. Looking at both of my studies, if you compare them, I really do think I learned a lot with both, but in a completely different way. The first one, I kind of nailed the proportion. I was just like, I think I really just nailed some of the rendering a little bit more and was pretty more subtle with things. But with my second attempt, I found out so much more. The things that really make Joe Mad's art and make it impactful, those things are, to recap, the line quality, as far as the line weight around, is a great focal point. If you group your shadows together, it counts as a simple shape and it doesn't count as detail, and so your mind interprets that in an easier way. If you look at the stylized anatomy, if you use a stylized wedge shape and use that T, the simple T kind of wedging, it makes your lines way more appealing because it's less to look at. The anatomy is going to look more contrasting. And he does that with gloves and other articles of clothing too. And then overall, the detail. You can add so much detail if you want to any piece of art, but Joe Mad lays low and puts the detail where it matters most. Wherever you have a focal point, circle it. A lot of times I do a sketch and I circle it, and only within that circle do I kind of put the extra detail. Throughout my art journey, I've always heard about line economy, and I knew the definition, but I didn't really experience it until today. Joe Mad has taught me line economy, and I think he can teach any of you guys it too, and you probably should. I think it's a very important skill to learn. So that's it for the video. If you guys like what you saw here, you can totally do it yourself. Find an artist you like, and it doesn't even need to be based upon line economy. It can be based on whatever, more detail if you wanted to study that. So I really do think it's a good way to go. So try copying from artists you admire and ask why every line exists. So drop your comments below, DM me on X, and send me a link to your studies if you have them online. I would really be interested to know what people are pulling from this video. If you want just an easy and quick way to improve your art every week, I send out a weekly email called Good Art Tips. And this is just something that you can read quickly, fill in some art gaps in your mind, but it's for storytellers, it's for comic artists, storyboard artists, and just people that want to draw cool stuff in general. I send it out every Wednesday. It's there in your inbox. And please join us. We're growing quickly, and hope to see you there. And lastly, just want to say thanks to Joe Madureira for making awesome stuff. We wouldn't have anything to study. I really do think he's a master at what he does, and stoked to be improving so much by studying his work. That's it, everybody. See you next time. Be good.